Hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual road trip. I'm Molly Berry with ATS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on board today as we visit Trey Worst of Ingevity and Matt Chandler of the Tennessee DOT. They're going to discuss the process and how to overcome some of the hurdles regarding vetting and specifying new technologies and products in our industry. So as a reminder, you're in listen-only mode. If you'd like to address our panel audibly, you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you so you can join the conversation. You can also type a question or comment in our Q&A box at any time. Our tour guides today are Tanya Nash, Trey Worst, and Matt Chandler. Tanya is our pavement materials engineer here at ATS. She earned her bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Florida in biomedical engineering. Tanya serves on many state and national committees and research projects, expanding her knowledge in asphalt properties and characteristics nationwide. Trey Worst is a senior technology development engineer at Ingevity Corporation. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in civil engineering from Clemson University, where he began working on warm mix asphalt used in porous asphalt. During his 10+ years at Ingevity, he has provided research and technical support for warm mix asphalt and product development for Ingevity's additives used in binder modification and recycling. Matthew Chandler is the Assistant Director of Materials for the Tennessee Department of Transportation. He served as the State Bituminous Engineer, as well as other various roles with the department in asset management, design, construction, and survey. Matt has been heavily involved with the Department of Specifications in various applications and has assisted in the evaluation of many new products and processes utilized in highway construction in Tennessee. He earned his bachelor's in civil engineering from Tennessee Tech University and his master's in civil engineering from the University of Tennessee. So you guys know how to ask questions and you just met our tour guide. So I think we're ready to start. Trey, I'm going to kick it over to you. We can get this thing going.
Thanks, Molly. I appreciate it. I'll share my screen, then you guys can let me know if you can see it. So it should be working now. Does that look right?
Yep, you're good.
All right. Yeah, so starting out, Trey Worst, thanks, Molly, for the introduction. This is, I work for Ingevity, so we're an additive supplier for warm mix, liquid anti-strip, emulsifiers, recycling, different types of technologies. On the screen, you should be able to see this is our headquarters building. We are based out of Charleston, South Carolina. So in the background, you can actually see this blue. I hope you guys can see my cursor. I assume you can. The blue tall structure here is one of our chemical plants. So we have 3 in North America. Most of our asphalt products are made in Charleston, South Carolina. And our technical center is just over here. Can't quite see it kind of as the bridge slips away here. But yes, if you're ever in town in Charleston and want to see some of our facilities, happy to show you around. But we do have research labs across the world. So we have 5 of them. The one I just mentioned in Charleston, then we have another facility in Tulsa, Oklahoma, one in France that services our products to Europe, Middle East, and Africa, one in India, and one in China. So a little bit of outline on what I'll talk about. I've got about a dozen or so slides, and so I won't take too much time here, but we'll discuss kind of how companies, especially growth-oriented companies, look at R&D metrics, how our company does, what goes into implementing new technology, some examples, and talk about a little bit about NetPep and QPLs and what kind of list and how we approach that. And then a little conversation on what's coming next for our industry as far as new technology. So if we think about, from my perspective in Ingevity, we have a bunch of areas that I mentioned we do development work in. A lot of our chemistry is based on the concept of surfactants or surface active agents. So similar to how soap works, right? We have a positively charged head group and negatively charged tail group. The tail group loves asphalt, right? Is oil loving. The head group is polar, loves water or aggregate. And so that we use these types, the same concept for when you wash your hands, right? The tail group, the surfactant likes the oil in your hands. The head group likes the water, and so it strips all the dirt, but also the oil off your hands, cleans your hands. We harness that same chemical energy into different asphalt applications, right? So we have in emulsifiers, we're using those tail groups to attract the different asphalt particles, and then the head groups repel each other on the different particles, so we can keep the particles suspended in a water wool environment to create an emulsion for a slurry seal or a micro or possibly a tack coat, all sorts of different applications, right? Liquid anti-strip, right? Similar. They're still using the tail grip to be attracted to the asphalt, but in this example, we're using the head group to be attracted to the aggregate interface, the aggregate surface, to create that strong adhesion bond. So, and similar in the rejuvenator space, the size of these matters. So we might cook different amounts of time, react with different products. Our facility that you saw, the plant in the background, is kind of like a refinery for trees, right? Everything that comes out of the tree, there's tall oil, and we take different cuts, react them to create different products. The length of the tail group might impact solubility or something, right? How much wrap you could solubilize, for example, and for a rejuvenator. So this is an example, these pictures at the bottom, of some of our initial rejuvenator work 10 plus years ago, where we would take different chemistries and put RAS, or wrap, in them in some different cases, and see how much asphalt binder we liberated, right, from the aggregate surface, to measure the change of viscosity of the chemical, to understand how we were impacting recycling wrap or RAS binder. So a lot of different examples, different areas. We're constantly trying to innovate in all these spaces. That's one thing we'll get into kind of the next slide. So concept of vitality index, and this is probably where I'd raise your hand if you guys are familiar with this, but I can't see your hands, of course. But we have a definition here to begin with. So vitality index, it's really a measure of an organization's ability to make new products, and we measure it as a percentage of the products sold over the last 5 years. What percentage comes from new products that were developed in the last 5 years compared to legacy products? And what that really does, and some companies look at 3 years, some companies look at shorter terms. It really does, it tells us how quickly, it gives us a metric of financially, are we adapting or not? So benefits of looking at this are, we're trying to stay relevant, right? There's new aggregate sources. There's new asphalt's changing, right? We all kind of know asphalt's changed a little bit the last 20 years, right? Tells us are we investing in R&D at the right level to create new products? Are we stimulating our employees by having new things to work on? Are we able to keep our customers that might have a new issue? Are we able to customer loyalty statistics that kind of go along with that? What it doesn't do, right, is it doesn't tell you, it doesn't really predict, right? It doesn't tell you if you're going to have a better one next year or a worse one next, vitality index. It doesn't tell you, tells you a percentage of your revenue that's from new products, but it doesn't tell you which product, or is that going up next year, or is it your most important products, or is it, all those type of things. It's not really prescriptive. It's not precise. So there's some drawbacks there. A lot of companies look at this, though. You can see the quote from 3M down at the bottom, a big construction, a big supplier of all kind of materials, right? Insulation, electrical, all sorts of industrial applications. But they were at 25% or so. It talked about in 2008, and it talks about in 2017, they're up to 40%. So they're obviously looking at that metric, right? We want to see that shift. Longevity does a very similar thing, and a lot of the chemical companies or other additive suppliers will be looking at similar metrics to see, are we adapting to what's happening in the industry changes? Are we creating new things? So this, from here, we'll shift a little bit, talk about some industry examples of specifying, vetting new technology. I think, we typically, when I first thought about this, or first talked about it with Tanya, we say, okay, we're going to have R&D, we're going to have some sort of industry partner or third party, and then we're going to get agency approval of a new additive. And that's bing, bing, bing. We have 3 steps. Is that how it works? It's kind of the question. And it's really, Matt and I talked a little bit about it yesterday. We talked about others agencies too, but and Matt will speak some more on this. I've actually kind of put a different graphic up here, right? So, and we think about this is an example from warm mix OGFCs, right? We sell a lot of additives for warm mix asphalt applications. Open graded friction course or porous asphalt that's used commonly in the Southeast. Last 10 years or so, we've seen people looking at alternatives maybe for using cellulose fibers in these mixes. And there's a variety of different alternatives in there to mitigate drain down. Drain down, the issue of the binder. We have a single graded aggregate source or a uniformly graded aggregate that's susceptible to drain down at high temperatures, typical asphalt mixing temperatures. So, we've had a product for a while that we would sell as a warm mix asphalt product. Our industry, we looking at, hey, where are some key spots where people could really benefit from this product? And we thought about, okay, if there's contractors, we're based out of South Carolina that had a fair amount of issues with their open graded friction course at the time with early raveling. I think construction issues is one of the things they were looking at. So we said, what if we could make those at low temperatures and mitigate the drain down without using the cellulose fibers if we think that's a hassle for the contractor. So what we did there, so you go from talking about R&D and concepts and some application testing in the lab, right? Looking at drain down, do we think this is going to work? Okay, we think this is going to work. Then we go to, and these steps can get kind of flipped here. Is there a contractor that's interested in this? Okay, yes, there is. We think there's an industry partner here that would be interested in this. Then what we did here is we said, okay, a lot of times people don't always love data that's coming from a supplier, right? Or they want to see some sort of validation of it on a small scale. So we did a series of small projects around the state that were not interstates projects, and we enlisted the help of Clemson University to do their own independent study on how drain down and warm mix asphalt related. Can you get rid of if you take out cellulose fibers, can you still work through the drain down issue at the desired binder content? So they did a bunch of data on that and saw that they thought it was possible. We had the small projects that we talked about. So there's a few steps on here that I don't even have in here of these 7 boxes. You could probably add a box or two. Then we went to the big agency trial. So the first one for us was for SCDOT, allowing that. And Cliff Selkenhouse would be a resource. You could chime in there on that. But so we went to that, had some good success. Then there's a field validation step, right? Then they want to go back, collect data, look and see how it performs for a few years, right? And that's different depending on the agency and the familiarity they have with the product. If it's been used in any other states before, all those type things. And then after that, we see that there's an agency approval process still, right? There's a QPL listing, or maybe there's a supplemental specification that allows the use of something, a different technology in lieu of cellulose fibers. And South Carolina DOT vetted a lot of things in this process, not just warm mix. And then at this point now, we've seen other states in the Southeast interested in this. So Tennessee has done a project like this year. I think Matt will mention. They've seen Alabama look at this. A number of different states look at this. But another thing to note at the industry adoption at the bottom, this really only works, right? Nothing frustrates an additive supplier or a DOT, I think Matt will say, as much as going through all this work and then nobody really wants to use something, right? It's a lot of work for nobody in the industry to adopt something. So I want to make sure these ideas turn into things that actually work and benefit our agencies and our contractors. So it's cool to see this industry adoption piece is probably the key part we're trying to get to through all these steps. So something to think about there. Let's see. Let's talk about the dilemma from a supplier. We hit on QPLs and things at the time. How do you decide which QPL you're going for and all that type of thing? Obviously, if you're trying to do business in a certain state, you're looking to you're going to have to go through whatever the hoops they have there in that region. So you're looking for states that have maybe early adopters on ideas, or maybe in certain states, the QPLs you would have. If you wanted to submit an additive as a liquid antistrip for a certain state, you might only have one shot, right? You have to pass a certain number of aggregates. If you don't pass, they're not in the business of retesting your additives over and over until they pass. And that makes a lot of sense, right? That's not how agencies work. So we might enlist the help of a third party. If we go back to this slide, this third party step is really critical, right? We want to vet our technology somewhere besides our own facility, our own lab, before we go to this agency option. And there's a lot of, so we talked about Clemson University in this example, ATS, and then we partner with them to do some stuff like this with Tanya before. People use NCAT, right? The big test track. There's one in Minnesota, obviously, as well, but to vet technology and see its performance before we go to an agency trial. And there's other additives. We could talk about other additives that have followed a similar model, right? If we talk about rejuvenators that followed a similar model, or maybe the HYMA process, something like that. So different additive suppliers could speak on different technologies here. But we want to get to where we're efficient here, right? Which we're targeting, where do we think that the additives have the best application? We put time on, put time to pass these QPLs. We vetted it, maybe a third party. And we might use, that could be regional, right? Some of you are doing work in the out west, you might use a lab in the western states, those type things that are familiar with that agency. And then we talk about, NetPep is a solution that's really come along lately. I think Matt, maybe Tanya will talk about that too some more, but National Transportation Product Evaluation Program, right? So for those of you that did not know exactly what the acronym was, I put that up there. I don't always remember that myself. But right, I hope it's a listing for additives for warm mix, liquid nanostrip. They talk about maybe adding rejuvenators to come. So it gives you a data set on the same aggregate or binder source to compare all these different additives. So there's a lot of value in seeing how those stack up against each other. What it doesn't do is it doesn't compare it with your aggregate source necessarily in your state. So regionally, they try to pick a couple different sources, but they can't do everything there. So there's some really good aspects of NetPep to be able to do one listing that could be used by a lot of different regions. There's also some pitfalls there if how well does it correlate to your state's materials. So that's switching gears a little bit here. What's next? I think, one thing as an innovation team, we're challenged with thinking through what's a big market gap? Do we think we can create a bridge to this whole new technology and just open up a whole new space that we would be able to supply our industry? That's really hard to do, right? I think most of the gains we do in the asphalt industry are incremental, right? So scary looking bridge, right? We had this bridge over here apparently that they used for a while. That wasn't it. So they've made some incremental advances there here. Maybe one day they're going to have a super nice bridge over here, right? But I think there's a challenge, and I've worked in R&D now for 10 years that there's setbacks, right? Resilience is important. There's also opportunities for incremental gains that we can't let perfect be the enemy of good, or good be the those type of analogies people talk about. So managing expectations and building and being, trying to get 1% better each day. There's all these cliches in this space, but how as an R&D group we can look at vitality index, and that's great to see the new things that, new iterations that we've created. But everybody wants these big market changing technologies, and those happen iteratively over time, I think. Some of our examples. Let's see. So a change is coming to our industry probably, right? So NAPA rolled out a big, the Road Forward program, their vision for net zero. How are we going to get there, right? Are we going to be zero carbon emissions by 2050? I think was their goal. Obviously, there's a lot of pieces to that, right? We're not going to build that bridge in the next 5 years. We're going to get there incrementally. Warm mix, maybe lowering our emissions, our grid for our power sources are going to change to become more renewable. We're going to probably have to embrace more recycling techniques, all sorts of things like that. These incremental advances that will happen over time here. If we're thinking about how we're going to get here, I know something from a additive supplier we're looking at, like what agencies are looking at emissions, right? There's New York DOT that's got a cap now on the asphalt temperature when it arrives at a paver. So if they're trying to be an early adopter. I think a lot of warm mix companies look at that as opportunities. Okay, how does our technology stack up? We want to vet that and see if we're able to decrease these emissions. I think New York's really driven by trying to get rid of the fugitive emissions at an asphalt plant, right? They want to showcase that they can do that so they don't get a negative reputation in their state for being an emission producer. Service life extension. There's agencies out there that are looking at how, service life in my state, cracking is a problem. They're talking about balanced mix design. What gets us there? Do we want, states that may be looking at, hey, what if we use, if we use an additive to try to get more light ends in our asphalt? What do we use an additive to reduce our temperatures to help us oxidize our asphalt less? And then there's states like somewhere like Colorado. There's some of the service life extension states, right? That second grouping there, places like Texas or Oklahoma, Kansas are looking at, what can we incentivize service life? Can we incentivize making mixes at lower temperature to reduce oxidation? How do we do that? Then there's a state like Colorado and some other agencies out there that are looking at EPDs, right? Our nutrition chart for our nutrition chart label, the back of your food item, we have a label for how many calories in it. This is how much energy it takes to make our asphalt pavement. And so is that an opportunity for our industry to showcase, what we can do, how sustainable we can be? Is that an additive space somehow where we can showcase improvements for our EPDs, our environmental product declarations? So a lot of different strategies out there for understand where our industry is going, and trying to understand how additive suppliers anticipate how to participate in those markets. So thinking about, I mentioned balanced mix design a little bit. I think Matt will probably talk about that a bit. A lot of states are looking at open up their mix designs, right? Moving away a little bit from volumetrics and looking at a cracking and a rutting performance test. This is a chart from the Balanced Mix Design Resource Guide. And so you can see here, this approach D, which is, really the most flexible, right? Just pass these tests. It's kind of what they're looking at. And maybe Matt can speak to what they're doing Balanced Mix Design wise, but I think a lot of ad suppliers view this as an opportunity, right? How do I stack up against the different things that are going on out there in our industry? How do we pass these tests and save the contractors money, save the DOT money, right? We're trying to incorporate innovation so that we're hopefully more efficient. So I think that's kind of summarizes some of my part. Appreciate you guys' time, and we'll probably switch on over to Matt here.
Perfect, awesome, thank you. All right, well, I said earlier, I'm Matt Chandler. I'm Assistant Director of Materials and Tests for Tennessee DOT. So kind of want to go through like our approach of what we're looking for when we get a product come in that wants to be approved, primarily focusing on more asphalt additives, stuff like that. So kind of coming in, first things we'd likely see, is we've got several kind of steps in our approval process, or several options, I guess. And we may ask you to do multiple of these, or maybe just one of them, kind of depending on how it shakes up. But typically, the first thing we're going to start with would be NetPep, which Trey mentioned earlier. TDOT's pretty bought into NetPep, so if there's a technical committee, we're going to try to steer you towards that. I'll cover NetPep a little bit more in depth in a minute, but it just provides a lot of value for us that we can get a lot more testing done. That way, with qualified lab, a third-party lab, gives us good results that we can believe in, that we can trust. Other things we might ask for would be like a demo, do something off our system we can kind of look at without the risk. Maybe a local jurisdiction, maybe private development, something pretty big. We might ask you reach out to a private accelerated lab or accelerated testing facility like NCAD or Inroads or somebody like that to try your product out. So we can do trial projects, and I'll cover that later. But I can only load roads in real time. These accelerated labs can simulate traffic for multiple years. So you can wait with me for 20 years to see if your product works, or you can get BuzzPal to test it in 3 years. So it's, I think the value there a lot of times is, if this is a good longevity product, the accelerated labs or the accelerated facilities are kind of the way to go. Other things typically we're going to ask that usually don't get a lot of pushback, but every once in a while a little bit is, we're going to be wanting to look at in the lab. We're going to test it ourselves. We're typically going to try to fingerprint it. A lot of what we do as the DOT is really quality assurance to make sure we're getting what we pay for. So one of those things, we got to know what your product is, so if we're going to be accepting it in the future, we can identify it. Other things is typically as we're getting to a product that we feel has more been proven or vetted a little bit better, we'll do a trial project. Typically try to get it out on the road, kind of get that field validation like Trey mentioned before. Usually these are asked to be donations. So we ask the material to be donated or the contractor to pay for it. And then we'll typically do a no-cost change order to allow the off-spec material to be used on our project, but we typically are not going to go out of the way to pay for that. So we consider that more of a research and development on your side, more of a demonstration to us. So we're not going to necessarily pay for that typically. There might be exceptions, but it's usually the way it works. And very rarely are we going to specify anything outright. We're in the business of getting projects delivered in a low bid system. Basically, you specify a product that's a sole source, limits competition. It's just going to drive up our prices. It's something we really try to avoid. It used to be against the federal regs, but they've actually relaxed it. But at least our state, we still feel that's a good policy, and so we still enforce it as best we can. There are exceptions, but for the most part, those are really fairly rare. You have to have a really good reason. Usually a product that's new doesn't have the history to prove that that's something that we're going to do. So people a lot of times ask for that, but that's usually a bridge too far for us. So go back and talk about NEPEP a minute. This is the National Transportation Product Evaluation Program. Basically, it's a joint venture with all the AASHTO states for us to pull our resources. So why should Tennessee have to test something that Mississippi has already tested is kind of the idea here. So we can kind of pull the tests together. It's kind of how it started out, and now it's kind of is growing more where AASHTO and NEPEP is actually just hiring labs to do all this testing. But it allows the states to see multiple or one test be shared with multiple states, I should say. So it's a very good way for us as DOTs to get good value for our investment in AASHTO. So we're not doing a lot of repetitive tests. And we believe it should be a good value for suppliers, especially for new products, because you have one test that gets in front of multiple states. There are some drawbacks with NEPEP. Trey mentioned there's a national program. So how many tests do you need to run to cover the whole United States? It'd be a lot. So one of the things is on these NEPEP technical committees is we try to figure out what's the right amount of tests, what's the right material to be as representative as possible to give value to each of the states that are members of the committee. So sometimes, decisions are made that maybe a state doesn't necessarily agree with, or they accept the NEPEP data, they still want to test it with their local materials. So we've done some of that ourselves where, we look at the NEPEP data to see if the product, works big picture wise, but we're like, we have this one aggregate in Tennessee that we think it's going to strip no matter what. So we're going to test it with that just in case. So you might see that where I just, you go through NEPEP and the state still wants you to ask, have more testing afterwards. So sometimes might be the reason is, we still want to see it with our own materials, but Tennessee, we're trying to move towards utilizing NEPEP as much as possible. We're trying to encourage our fellow states in that path as well. We really think there's a lot of value in it. Next thing kind of is, once we have products that feel like they're good products that have a history that seem like they're going to work, we'll typically go and try to have a trial section. So the idea here is, think these are products that are not going to fail. Like I'm putting a little risk out here, so I'm putting these on the road. So kind of having get some trust before we get here. These are just kind of an example of 5 projects I've done in the last few years or helped do in the last few years. Trey mentioned the War Mix OGFC we did just south of Nashville a few years ago. But these kind of serve several purposes. You know, they're final projects in the finally getting on the ground, letting us feel it, touch it, see how it goes. But also they're really viability studies. So we'll try to set them up, so that we get good data. Typically try to set up something like this where we have a control, so we can, evaluate. But like I said earlier, I won't know an answer on this truly for 10, 15, 20 years. So that's no good to anybody, right? We want to, you want me to approve it yesterday. I want to approve it before I retire. It's kind of, it's not in everybody's interest or anybody's interest to wait till the road actually dies at old age to see if your product helped or not. So a lot of times we're really basing that decision off of the other data, so private lab data testing or NetPet testing, or your history off system. But what we're just trying to see here is this product really got some constructability? Does it have some practicality for us? So I kind of look at this as an audition of the application to our program more so than whether it's going to work or not. Because I'm going to try not to put product on a road that I don't think is going to work. So what's that really mean? So you get a product that we like, why not just add it to the QPL? So if we like it, seems to work, we have no real worries or here or not. That's great. We want to add stuff to the QPL. We want innovation. We want more competition. We want more suppliers. All that's good for us. We want that to happen. But there are cases where does it really fit how we do business? And if it's not going to work with our business model, with how our contracting partners do business, or how we accept a project, is it really worth our time to add it to the QPL? A lot of times I try to kind of screen out some of these products, tell people on the front end, we don't really do that. We don't really have a place for that here. You might be better off with another place. But we'll evaluate pretty much anything, but sometimes stuff that it's a great idea, it just doesn't work. And so, what do I mean by that necessarily? So, there's just other considerations other than cost and performance. I think with the DOT is we're probably going to be the most conservative owners of a roadway system that you're trying to sell to. We own the interstates. We're trying to make sure those are high value, high risk to the public. Something goes wrong there, all that turns back to us. We tried something different and it failed. That hurts us from ever doing something new again, or basically makes it harder at least. It probably also kills your product ever for me and use. I can think of the old 1990s rubber mixes. Only had a few of those projects in Tennessee. We tried to have a GTR binder in Tennessee 30 years later, and it was a really hard sell. So it's just, you don't want to have a big thing fail, especially in a high profile project. But so how, what ways are the issues of how it fits into a program that might be the thing that holds it back? So can we test it? Can you prove your product works? So we have say standard testing. We'll test binders with the DSR. We'll find out DSR, the massacre values for the binder. The product modifies binder, but it doesn't modify binder in a way a DSR can find it. The way my spec reads, you can't prove it worked. And so I know there are products out there that this works for, but I can't fit them into my spec at the moment. So it's kind of my thing is, should I write a spec for one product then to compete against other products? So if I have standard test and I say everybody except for product X has to meet the standard test, all the other guys that have to meet the test are going to be really upset. And rightly so, they're being held to a different standard. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to write specs to get competition, to get multiple bids on a project so that we can let a project for the lowest reasonable bid. So doing things that cause a bunch of different specs or make the price different is really a difficult thing for us to do. So can your product be tested how we test it? If it can't, then the consideration is how hard is it for me to train someone else to do that on a different test method? Can that test method be reliable? Is that test method defendable? A lot of kind of issues becomes difficult to actually adopt something. So it could be great, but if I can't test for it, I can't prove it's there. It makes a kind of an issue there for us. Next thing is can a contractor utilize it? If so, will they? So is it easy for them to use? Is it cost competitive? So we go through all this trouble of getting you approved to the QPL, but your product adds $50 a ton. They're never going to use it, or it requires 12 extra people at the plant. It's something that's just not very convenient. So it's one of those things is, do I feel like it's a reasonable opportunity here for us to improve a process? And if so, is it reasonable to expect that the contractors are going to be interested in it? So another thing is you go to a trial project and you get the vendor rep out there, they make sure the project goes great. But what happens when they go home? Is the process now that's been changed, is it something that can be run at 2 a.m. without supervision, basically? So if the plant breaks down or something, the process doesn't work out right, is it simple enough that the contractor can be trained by the supplier to fix it, get it working right? So that's great. But if it's something that's going to be really complicated, that we're going to feel like there's always going to be quality issues, that's going to be something that we're going to have to think about really hard. And the other thing, kind of mentioned a little bit the other slide, but does it fit into a spec? So, from the point of view for us testing is one thing, but for the point of view of how do we pay for it? How do we accept the product? If it's something that we don't measure for payment, how do you sell that to a contractor to add on to their process, basically? So things like that, we always have to try to keep in mind. And then kind of going back to I guess that last point is, currently a lot of our states, most of the states I think are still in a volumetric mix design process. So I would love for our asphalt mixes to be designed by performance. We're not quite there. A lot of states are moving towards a balanced mix design of some type. And I think once that's there, it opens up the door for a lot of these products. But currently, my mix design process is, do you get 4% air voids? And that's about the only question we ask. We have a few other things, but for the most thing, can you get air voids is all we're really testing for. And so your product makes the asphalt last 5 years longer. Well, I don't test for that. So I can't consider that in the mix design. I can't really consider that in the acceptance right now. I don't have a process to do that. And so you have these products that I think are good products, but they don't fit into a volumetric system. And so at the moment, I really have no way to utilize them. And so we're aware of that. We're working on that. We would like to fix that. But it's not quite there yet. Trey showed there's a lot of states there that are moving towards balanced mix design. The amount of research that it would require to get there is a lot, and it's taken us some time. So hopefully one day we'll just keep pedaling along with that. Where we are. A couple other things is maybe DOT is not the first place to go. So start with the cities would be my advice. Start with your local developers. And I always get pushback on this is like, well, they use your spec book. Yeah, and we are quite aware of that. We I know y'all are frustrated by that. We are almost as frustrated by that as well. We don't want to be the clearinghouse for materials. We just sometimes happen to be that. So there's things that don't really like I said, don't fit on our system, but we're the ones that everyone has to approve it, because that way it lets every little town and in the state and every private development is like, oh well, it's in TDOT's book, so it's okay. That's just sometimes it's not the greatest approach, I think, but I've seen a lot of good demos on private developments. We've had a project between an asphalt terminal and a sand barge location. The place does truck every 30 seconds, and the product has really improved that road quite a bit. So maybe that was a great torture test, a great proving ground for that product. And so that makes it more, that removed the risk for me from trying it, but now I got to see that they survived there. So now I can feel good about putting it on the interstate. But if you've done that, keep in mind that how you market to a city or a private development is probably a little bit different than how you market to a DOT and to a contractor doing DOT work. One of the big ones I see a lot of times is people showing how they can use their product to reduce the thickness of a pavement. And that's a great idea, especially for a private developer. And the DOT, sometimes plans take a long time to build. All the grades for drainage outlets, for ditches, for sidewalks, everything's set based off of that finished grade of the pavement. So if you're all at the end of the project coming in and trying to reduce that, it doesn't really do us a lot of good. And that's that's kind of an annoyance there, but not the biggest issue. Biggest issue is we pay the contractor by the ton of asphalt. So you're trying to sell a product that is reducing their tonnage. That's a good luck with that one, I guess is what I'm saying. That's you're cutting them out basically. So you take that kind of approach, it's going to be hard to sell. But a lot of times that same idea, if you can make something thinner and work, you can also make something of the same thickness, maybe last longer. So just kind of thinking how you market that. So you'll be amazed at how much marketing I get about thinning our pavements up. So just an issue I always think is kind of interesting. So all that is basically told you all the reasons why we don't want to change. That's not really what I wanted to get out of this. We really do want to change. We really want to have innovation. We are seeing our budget every year continually shrunk by inflation. We did have a Tennessee did have a tax increase for our gas tax not too long ago, so our budget's helped a little bit, but the federal tax rate's still the same. So our budget rate, is still not where it was. And so we did find products that'll make stuff last longer. That'll help us stretch our dollars. But we also have to consider that it's not that it just has to work, but it has to work in a way that we can spec that makes the contractor care about it. It also has to be something that's measurable, but also that a technician with minimal experience or training should be able to do fairly accurately and repeatably. And then the test that we're using to do this has to be accurate and also be something that we can defend the results for. So, if it come back and say the test fails, well, if it's a test no one's ever heard of, it'll be hard to defend that. So, I want to make sure what we're doing is something that we can reasonably use in our system. So, I think that's my last bit of my slide. So, hopefully, it's more positive note there to end with.
All right. Great. Thank you, Trey and Matt. I really appreciate the input from both of you. We don't have any questions yet on the Q&A, but I do have a couple of things that I wanted to kind of ask both of you. And one thing kind of touches on, Matt, something that you just said about, just you were talking about the specification changes, and you don't want to have like 1,000 different specifications for every single product that is going on. And I totally understand that, but you end up with these products that are trying to fit in this box of the specification per se, right? But we've all acknowledged across the industry that the performance designs are coming up the road to enhance the performance. So if the performance was good and the specifications were solid as is, we're trying to fit in the previous box of performance rather than unless there's something else that I'm missing. Does that seem like something that maybe open the door for that portion of the innovation to be able to say, oh, well, yes, I understand. I'm maybe 98% of it inside this box of your specification, but there's still kind of like a toe kind of sticking out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're saying with staying in with our current spec, as we
Just any spec. I mean, you start thinking about it across the board. Everybody's trying to fit a current specification that a state holds.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those. Spec is the spec, and so you don't want to necessarily, say we can ignore that one line there, but we do try to take into account innovations come and try to work with stuff like that. So we'll a one-off project or something that we can put out. It's definitely fairly easy to make it like long term. I know every state's a little different on this, but we'll update our spec book once a year at least, or maybe twice a year, so we can we're not opposed to changing if there's something like that we can fix. But I mean, ultimately, you're trying to get multiple bidders, and so if you're like, well, you met almost all the spec, we let you change here. Our next bidder, could have complaints on that. So well, I knew you were going to ignore the spec here. That would have been different. So trying to keep us on a level playing field, you kind of have to. The spec is the spec.
All right. Trey, I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I see Matt's point. I mean, if you have to be consistent, right? I think people appreciate consistency, understanding. I think if there's a new technology or an additive or something that you want to use, I think going through that process of vetting it with a third party or with a city or something like Matt talked about, and then being able to come to an agency to showcase, okay, if we make these changes, this could open up this X opportunity. So I think there has to be a reason to change a spec. It's kind of what Matt's saying too, right? Don't just tweak it based on small, slight preferences or issues. We want to create a new opportunity.
We have a question from Mohan Malbushi, and the question is from Matt, and they're inquiring whether or not Tennessee has any programs for plastic recycling.
Last bit, I'm sorry.
For plastic recycling?
Plastic recycling?
Yeah.
No, not yet. We joined the what's it called? The Innovation Pooled Fund with NCAT. So we're in that research, but we're not don't currently have any products.
Okay. And Grover Allen has commented just pointing out that thinner pavement doesn't necessarily mean less mixed tons for the contractor. Could mean the contractor pays more lane miles at a reduced thickness. Is there a shortage of lane miles to pave? Yeah,
I can see what you're saying. I guess my point is typically when I think of QPL stuff, at least how it works in Tennessee, is it's stuff that's the contractor optional, basically. So the plans, they're already set up. These are things that the contractor can utilize, but they don't have to utilize. So if we planned around those thinner lane miles, then yeah, we could have a bit more projects. But if we didn't, which is most likely the case with QPL item, then no, the limits of the project are the limits of the project. So, yeah, if you change your program based off of it happening continuously, yeah, sure. But one or two products, one or two projects is not going to change the amount. So, and the cost, it's really cost is what limits our budget. Is our budget than necessarily the miles. So, the cost is the same to pave it thinner with a different additive, but it really didn't help add lane miles.
Okay, and then a question from Joe LaRusso is, are there federal and state requirements to review and implement innovation, and how much funding is typically budgeted?
That's a good question. I'm not positive.
I like that question too.
They've got I don't know. I'm not an expert on it. I know they allow us to try stuff, but I'm not sure exactly how that works necessarily.
Trey, I don't know if you happen to
I don't know.
any of that or not.
Yeah, I don't know that scope of the number. I mean, obviously, if it fits within the scope of a project, a lot of things can get evaluated. It depends on how well an additive makes sense with the project, right? In some cases, but yeah, I mean, agencies aren't really a clearinghouse for. They don't want to be a clearinghouse for all sorts of different additives, right? That you can't just evaluate things and send a report out. That's not their purpose, right? So
Right.
tricky. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that that's super tricky, and please don't take my word on this comment, but I do think that you may end up having more of a chance for some of this federal funding, especially with that new bill that passed, and with the appropriations going out to not just the states but to the local agencies as well. So I think some of that money they're going to be willing to spend kind of a little bit more on these innovations, on the sustainability factors of things, trying to account for that. So as the money gets distributed even into the lower agencies, I think that's a big thing to watch. Okay, let's see. I think we have time for one or two more questions. So I have a question on the sense of, Trey, you had talked a little bit about you constantly trying to bring new products in, right? So you guys have a pipeline that you kind of run your products through. And if you end up hitting kind of like that eureka moment in the lab, but it's new and there is not a market, so to speak, in the industry, meaning that it's not, for instance, like a liquid anti-strip or even an emulsifier. It's something new. It's a different venue. So from a producer standpoint, what kind of things do you try to look at when approaching a state? And then Matt, I'm going to let you follow up on the idea of when there is that brand spanking new shiny new car thing coming in the door, they say, hey, it's not like anything else. So maybe it's some kind of weird thing that you don't have a category for. So then what is the best approach on both sides?
Yeah. So one example I think of obviously is warm mix, right? I mean, it's been 15 plus years since that development really started in the U.S. And we were part of that. I talked a little bit about it in the presentation, and Matt talked about it too. I think that the third-party evaluation part with something like Utah and ATS, a place like NCAT obviously gets a fair amount of publicity on that. But it's we would first take something to a local contractor who was willing to try something with probably an NDA agreement or something like that, and then we would move on to trying it on a different scale. And then we might move to an NCAT test track sort of setup like we did with warm mix in the late 2000s. And then by that time, 2010 or so, you're seeing a lot of states doing a variety of warm mix additive trial projects, comparing the different ones. So very stepwise process that I think always has to include that small scale, and that I think that third party thing is really big when you're starting out before you talk to a DOT. No DOT wants to be the experimental group, right? So
yeah, I'll say there's NetPep has a program that's changed names. So it was APEL, I think it's now Up 3 or Up Cubed. So it's basically a miscellaneous NetPep committee. So that's probably one of the things we would lean towards is, this doesn't really fit any box. So send it to that committee and see, can they evaluate the claims, as an independent. So like Trey said, third party lab testing is a good way for us to kind of find some value there. If it's not like anything else, I mean, it's going to be something that's kind of gets into difficult territory with sole sourcing. So how do we justify that? There's certain things that, if it has a good case to be made, we can make that case. But if it's, only is very similar to something else, it's hard to necessarily say, this, we got to completely change the process to do this new thing. It's just kind of difficult when, especially, it's the only product that does that. Kind of walking a fine line there of innovation and having a single bidder. So we really try to avoid that single bidder. That's just not good for business, basically. I I think the third-party testing is really vital for something like that. You're going to have to prove it somewhere else, I think, really, before we're going to get on board. Like I said, we're probably the most conservative people you're trying to sell stuff to.
And it's a good segue. Danny Gerhardt just wrote a comment saying that, following up on one of Trey's points, speaking as a former DOT bituminous engineer, I agree that agencies tend to want to see that when the product works as intended from a third party, another agency, etc. Third party data results carry a lot of weight with the agencies. And I understand that completely. And I would just say it's just more so like when they do come to table with all that information, it's still a brand new thing for you. So it's just kind of that moment where it's just like they do all their homework, they get all their trials that locally, and they get all the research done independently. And now they're sitting at the table. So it's just kind of like the question of now what happens?
Yeah, I mean, we've had some issues, or not issues, but stuff like that, and it's you try to figure out, can we utilize them? I guess. And, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. So there's it's case by case. I guess it's not really helpful advice on this.
I know it's never an easy, straightforward answer.
Yeah.
So overall, I would say big picture, right? Trey, especially, I think that you covered a lot of that with the one schematic that you had with the steps in it. And remember it as you go, these product or the producers as they're going forward, budget, time, expect to donate the material, test sections, visibility, get out there, market, and be willing to hit the pavement and sell. Be able to get that right marketing message as Matt was talking about.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Thank you so much for all your insight. Thank you for everybody for tuning in and joining us today. We're going to take May off, maybe do a real road trip, Tanya, instead of a virtual road trip. So join us back in June. I think June 15th is our next session. We'll be with Brett Stanton from the Asphalt Pavement Association of Michigan, Eric Beal from the Ohio DOT, and Corey Pelletier from Anderson, Columbia. We're going to look at producing and paving with more RAP. So we have an association, an agency, and a contractor's point of view. So that'll be a really good panel discussion if you guys can tune in then. That's June 15th. Have a great day. Thank you all again. Tanya, Matt, Trey, good to see you guys.
All right. Thank you.
Good job. Thanks.